Imagine the darkest night of your life. Not the darkness of a power outage. Not the temporary darkness of grief that you know will eventually lift. But a darkness so total, so consuming, that you begin to wonder, truly wonder, whether God himself has looked away. Now imagine writing a poem in that moment. Not to complain, not simply to cry, but to wrestle, to demand an answer from the silence, to pour 3,000 years' worth of human suffering into 22 verses, and somehow, impossibly, arrive at praise on the other side. That is what happened here. Somewhere in the ancient hills of Judea, perhaps in a royal chamber, perhaps in the open wilderness, perhaps in a cave where the wind carried no comfort, a man named David picked up his reed pen, pressed it against parchment, and wrote the words that would echo across every century that followed. My God, why have you forsaken me? This is the story of that moment. This is the story of Psalm 22. To understand the agony of Psalm 22, you must first understand the man who wrote it, because David was not simply a king. He was a contradiction, a living paradox wrapped in royal robes and shepherd's dust. He was born in Bethlehem, the youngest of 8 sons of a man named Jesse. In ancient Israelite culture, the youngest son was the last to inherit, the last to be considered, the last to be called when the prophet arrived at the door. When the great prophet Samuel came to Jesse's household to anoint the next king of Israel, Jesse did not even call David from the fields. He did not think it worth mentioning that he had one more son. That detail is not incidental. It is the seed of everything. David grew up invisible. He grew up spending his days alone in the wilderness of Judea, guarding his father's sheep on the hillsides above Bethlehem. He slept under open skies. He fought off lions and bears with his bare hands and a wooden staff. He learned to read the language of storms, of seasons, of predators circling in the dark. And in that solitude, in that vast, indifferent wilderness, he composed music. The ancient Jewish tradition is explicit. David was not merely a warrior or a king. He was a poet of extraordinary sensitivity. The Talmudic tradition credits him with the entire book of Psalms, and while scholars recognize that the collection spans multiple authors across centuries, the core Davidic Psalms, those marked Le David, meaning of David or belonging to David, carry a biographical weight so precise, so psychologically raw, that it is nearly impossible to separate the poems from the man's actual experience. Psalm 22 bears the heading in the original Hebrew, Lamenatzeach al Ayelet Hashachar, which translates as to the choir master, according to the doe of the morning. The phrase itself is haunting, the doe of the morning, a deer caught in the first pale light of dawn, trembling, exposed, hunted. It is not a musical instruction alone, it is a portrait of the poet himself. David was a man who had been chosen by God at an age when he was not even chosen by his own father. He had been anointed king while still smelling of sheep and field. He had slain the Philistine giant Goliath with a shepherd's sling, and in doing so, had become the most celebrated young warrior in Israel. He had served in the court of King Saul, played the harp to soothe the king's troubled mind, and been embraced as a son. And then everything collapsed. Saul, tormented by jealousy, by the encroaching madness that the ancient texts describe as an evil spirit, turned on David with murderous fury. David went from the palace to the wilderness almost overnight, from the banquet table to the caves of En-Gedi, from royal favor to a hunted fugitive. The man who wrote Psalm 22 understood abandonment not as a philosophical concept, but as a lived, physical, terrifying reality. Here is where historians and theologians have long debated, because Psalm 22 carries no single neat historical label. Unlike Psalm 51, which the biblical text explicitly links to David's moral collapse after his affair with Bathsheba, Psalm 22 is left, deliberately it seems, without a specific date, without a named battle, without an obvious marker. And yet the internal evidence of the psalm itself tells a story so vivid, so geographically and emotionally specific, that we can reconstruct the probable world in which it was born. Consider the language. David describes himself as a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. He speaks of being poured out like water, his bones out of joint, his heart melted like wax within him. He speaks of enemies surrounding him like a pack of dogs, like a gang of evildoers. He describes them dividing his garments among themselves and casting lots for his clothing. This is not metaphor invented at a writing desk. This is the language of a man who has experienced or is experiencing physical siege, real enemies, real exhaustion, real public humiliation. The most compelling historical context, endorsed by rabbinical commentators and modern biblical scholars alike, places the composition of Psalm 22 during one of the most catastrophic periods of David's life, the rebellion of his own son, Absalom. Imagine what that meant. Absalom, beautiful, charismatic, beloved by the people, had staged a political coup against his own father. He had spent years sitting at the gates of Jerusalem, personally greeting every Israelite who came to bring a dispute before the king, whispering to each of them, "Your case is good and right, but the king has no one to hear you." He stole the hearts of Israel, methodically, strategically, over 4 long years. And then he declared himself king. David did not fight his son from the palace walls. He wept. He wrapped his head in mourning cloth, removed his sandals in the ancient gesture of humiliation, and walked barefoot out of Jerusalem, his own capital city, the city he had conquered and made great, while his own people threw rocks at him and cursed him in the streets. The biblical account in 2 Samuel describes the scene with almost unbearable restraint. David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot and with his head covered, and all the people who were with him covered their heads, and they went up, weeping as they went. This is the moment. The most powerful king in the ancient Near East, a man who had defeated empires, who had danced before the Ark of the Covenant, who had been called a man after God's own heart, was now a refugee. He was crossing the Jordan River with a small band of loyal followers, sleeping in the wilderness, completely uncertain whether he would live or die. And in that wilderness night, that terrible, silent, forsaken night, the words came, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. Notice the precision of those words. Not, God has forsaken me, but my God. Even in the pit of despair, David does not release his grip on the relationship. He cries out in ownership, in wounded, desperate intimacy. This is not a man who has stopped believing. This is a man who believes so completely that the silence of God feels like a personal betrayal. That distinction is everything. Let us now move through the psalm itself, not as a religious text to be recited, but as a document of crisis, a psychological autopsy of a man unraveling at the seams and somehow, impossibly, holding together. Verses 1 through 5 establish the paradox at the heart of the entire poem. David does not simply complain that God is absent. He builds a case. He reminds God of his own track record. In you, our ancestors put their trust. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you, they cried out and were saved. In you, they trusted and were not put to shame. This is ancient Hebrew rhetoric at its most sophisticated. David is essentially saying, you have a history of showing up. You showed up for Abraham. You showed up for Moses. You parted the Red Sea. You brought water from a rock. So where are you now? The argument is not sacrilegious. In the Hebrew tradition, and this is critical for a modern audience to understand, arguing with God is not a sign of faithlessness. It is, paradoxically, a sign of the deepest faith. The very name Israel means one who wrestles with God. From Jacob wrestling the angel at the ford of the Jabbok River, to Moses interceding for the people at Sinai, the Hebrew scriptures are saturated with the theology of holy argument. You only argue with someone whose authority you recognize. You only plead with someone you believe has the power to act. David is not walking away from God. He is grabbing God by the collar. Verses 6 through 8 then plunge us into the raw geography of humiliation. I am a worm and not a man. The word used in the Hebrew is tola, a specific kind of crimson worm, the Coccus ilitis, that in the ancient world was crushed to produce red dye. It was an image every Israelite would have understood immediately. The worm existed to be crushed. Its value came from its destruction. David is saying, I have been reduced to something that exists only to be destroyed for the convenience of others. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. This maps precisely onto the historical narrative of his flight from Jerusalem. The biblical text names a specific man, Shimei, son of Gera, who ran alongside David's procession, throwing stones and shouting curses. One of David's generals, Abishai, asked for permission to remove Shimei's head. David refused. He said, "Perhaps the Lord has told him to curse me." Even in his darkest hour, David absorbed public humiliation with a kind of terrible grace. Verses 12 through 18 build to the most visceral, almost physically agonizing section of the entire psalm. Many bulls surround me. Strong bulls of Bashan encircle me. Bashan, in the ancient geography of Israel, was a region east of the Jordan River known for its massive, well-fed cattle. When David evokes bulls of Bashan, he is conjuring the image of massive, powerful, ruthless forces bearing down on something small and cornered. Then comes the physical inventory of collapse. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It has melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Medical and psychological scholars have noted, with some astonishment, that this description matches almost clinically the physiological symptoms of extreme psychological trauma, dehydration, dissociation, the physical sensation of the heartbeat becoming irregular under extreme stress, the collapse of muscular coordination. Whether David was aware of the clinical precision of his language is irrelevant. He was describing from the inside what it felt like to be breaking apart. Then the dogs appear. Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. In ancient Israelite culture, calling someone a dog was among the deepest possible insults. Dogs were not pets. They were scavengers. They roamed in packs outside city walls, feeding on refuse and corpses. To describe your enemies as dogs was to say, these are not honorable opponents. These are carrion feeders circling a dying body. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. This single line has haunted readers for 3,000 years. In its immediate historical context, it speaks of total military defeat, the moment when a fallen warrior's possessions are stripped from him by his conquerors. In David's case, it speaks of the total stripping of identity, of dignity, of the outward markers of kingship. He had been reduced to nothing, and yet, at verse 19, something shifts. Something extraordinary happens in the architecture of this poem, and it happens not because the circumstances change, not because the enemies retreat, not because God suddenly breaks his silence with a thunderclap from heaven. The shift is entirely internal. But you, Lord, do not be far from me. You are my strength. Come quickly to help me. David turns. In the middle of the siege, in the middle of the encirclement, in the middle of the dogs and the bulls and the dust and the broken body, he turns toward God rather than away. Not because he has received an answer, but because he chooses to. This is, arguably, the most radical act of will in all of ancient Hebrew poetry. The philosopher Simone Weil once wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. What David demonstrates here is the inverse of that truth, that directing one's full, agonized attention toward God in the moment of maximum suffering is the rarest and purest form of faith. It is not the faith of the comfortable. It is the faith of the wrecked, the abandoned, the man sleeping in the wilderness with rocks for a pillow and enemies at the perimeter. From verse 22 onward, the psalm enters a register so different from its opening that some scholars have suggested it must be a separate composition entirely. The tone is not just different, it is transfigured. I will declare your name to my people. In the assembly, I will praise you. For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. The tense shifts, the posture shifts. The man who opened the psalm crying, "Why have you forsaken me?" is now declaring that God has, in fact, heard him. Not that the crisis has ended, but that in the act of crying out, in the raw, unfiltered, theologically sophisticated act of demanding to be heard, something in the relationship between this man and his God has been confirmed rather than broken. The psalm closes with one of the most sweeping visions in all of ancient Hebrew literature. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. Posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. The man who opened this psalm as a single desperate voice crying into cosmic silence closes it as a prophet speaking to all of history, to every nation, to generations not yet born. He has done it. 3 words in English. In the original Hebrew, a single word. Asa. He acted. He completed. He has done what needed to be done. Psalm 22 did not stay contained within the life of its author. Something about its architecture, its movement from total desolation to cosmic praise, meant that it kept resonating far beyond its original moment. It became the language that others reached for when their own language failed. The most famous invocation of Psalm 22 in all of history came approximately 1,000 years after. David wrote it in a moment so dramatic, so historically documented, that it transformed the psalm's meaning for half the world. According to the 4 gospel accounts of the New Testament, as Jesus of Nazareth hung dying on a Roman cross outside the walls of Jerusalem, he cried out in Aramaic, the common language of the region, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which is a direct quotation of the opening of Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me?" The specificity of this is staggering. This was not a man randomly reaching for a comforting thought. In Jewish tradition, when a rabbi quoted the opening line of a psalm, he was invoking the entire psalm. Every educated Jewish listener in that crowd would have known immediately which text was being referenced. They would have heard the entire arc, the desolation, the dogs, the pierced hands and feet, the divided garments, the turning point, and the final declaration, he has done it. The Gospel writers note, with their characteristic understatement, that the soldiers at the foot of the cross divided Jesus' garments and cast lots for his seamless robe. Whether one approaches this as history, theology, or literary analysis, the convergence is undeniable. Psalm 22, written by a fleeing king in the wilderness of ancient Judea, mapped itself onto an execution outside a Roman city wall with an precision that has occupied the greatest theological minds in history for 2,000 years. But the Psalm's reach does not end there. In the years following the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, in 70 CE, when Jewish communities were scattered across the Roman Empire in a catastrophic diaspora, Psalm 22 became one of the central liturgical texts of communal mourning and resilience. Communities that had lost everything, their temple, their city, their political existence, found in David's words the precise language for their own condition. The worm, the surrounding nations, the mocking crowds, the division of possessions, all of it was theirs too. The psalm became a kind of permanent grammar of catastrophic loss, a framework that individuals and communities could inhabit when their own words ran out. The historical narrative of David's story does have a resolution. It is not a neat one. It is not a Hollywood ending, but it is real, and its reality is what makes it meaningful. The rebellion of Absalom ended in military defeat for the son and devastating personal loss for the father. Absalom was killed, despite David's explicit command that his son be captured alive. When his flowing hair caught in the branches of an oak tree, David cried out, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which is a direct quotation of the opening of Psalm 22. The psalm closes with one of the most sweeping visions in all of history. In the original Hebrew, a single word. Asa. He acted. He completed. He has done it. The gospel writers note, with their characteristic understatement, that the soldiers at the foot of the cross divided Jesus' garments and cast lots for his seamless robe. Whether one approaches this as history, theology, or literary analysis, the convergence is undeniable. Psalm 22, written by a fleeing king in the wilderness of ancient Judea, mapped itself onto an execution outside a Roman city wall with an precision that has occupied the greatest theological minds in history for 2,000 years. as his mule ran beneath it. He hung there, suspended between earth and heaven, until David's general Joab ran 3 javelins through him. When the news reached David, the biblical account captures his response in words so raw they seem to have been reported verbatim rather than composed. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." David was restored to Jerusalem. He returned to the throne. The crisis passed, but the man who returned was not the same man who had danced before the Ark of the Covenant in the days of his greatest joy. He was older. He was broken in ways that did not fully heal. He carried the weight of his own moral failures, the loss of multiple children, the knowledge that the sword would never entirely leave his household. And yet, he kept writing. The Psalms attributed to David span the full arc of his life. They range from explosive joy to crushing despair, from militant confidence to whispered confession. Together, they constitute not a sanitized religious document, but a fully realized human life set to music. A life that believed deeply, failed catastrophically, suffered extensively, and kept, against all reasonable expectation, returning to the conversation with God. That is his legacy, not the battles, not the empire, not even the lineage, but the willingness to keep talking, and the art with which he did it. Here is what is remarkable. The scroll on which Psalm 22 was first written has long since turned to dust. The wilderness where David walked barefoot in mourning is now crossed by modern highways. The kingdom of Israel that he built, and his son nearly destroyed, is a chapter in archaeology textbooks. And yet, every single day, somewhere in the world, someone opens to Psalm 22 and reads those first 7 words. My God, why have you forsaken me?" And feels, for the first time, that someone finally understands. The hospice patient in the middle of the night, watching the clock between doses of pain medication, wondering whether their prayers are reaching anywhere. They find it here. The mother who has buried a child, sitting in a house that has become too quiet, unable to explain to anyone why she can no longer find God in the places she used to find him. She finds it here. The refugee who has crossed a border with nothing, who has left behind everything that once told him who he was, who looks at his hands and wonders what they are for now. He finds it here. The teenager who cannot name what is wrong, only that something fundamental has broken inside her, and the language for it does not yet exist. She finds it here, 3,000 years ago, a man in a wilderness, a former shepherd, a broken king, a poet who could not stop composing even in his worst moments, gave the world something more durable than any empire he might have built. He gave the world permission to say, "I am not okay, and I am still here, and I am still speaking to you, because I refuse to believe that the silence is the final answer." He began the psalm as a worm, Tola, the creature that exists only to be crushed. He ended it as a prophet, the voice of future generations, of nations not yet born, of people standing in futures he could not see, reading his words and recognizing themselves in them. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, "He has done it." The man who wrote those words did not know he was describing us. He did not know that 3,000 years later, in a world he could not have imagined, the people yet unborn would be sitting in the glow of a screen in the quiet of their own wilderness moments, finding in his ancient, desperate, breathtakingly honest words a companion, not an answer, not a formula, not a promise that the crisis will end by Tuesday, but a companion, someone who was there before them, someone who crawled into the same dark and came out the other side, someone who wrote it all down, the worm, the dogs, the parched mouth, the hollow bones, the silence of God, and who found, in the very act of writing it, that the silence was not quite as total as it had seemed. David, son of Jesse, shepherd of Bethlehem, king of Israel, exile in his own land, he left us a poem, and somehow, impossibly, it is still warm. He has done it.